And we are very happy to invite our second speaker. It's Steve Rayner. He is a James Martin Professor at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society at University of Oxford. And Steve Rayner has written extensively on risk and the governance of climate change and geoengineering. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. Is that picking up? No?
No?
No? Oh, you put it on mute. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
I won't take it personally on this occasion. Okay, that's better. Thank you. Technology, don't you love it? The last time I was here in Norrköping was about 3 years ago, and I gave a presentation called "How to Eat an Elephant." And as many of you know, the answer to that question is one piece at a time. And today it seems appropriate to revisit that theme and to explore some of the issues to do with scholarship and politics post-Copenhagen. But I think that in order to understand the post-Copenhagen situation, for me at least, it's necessary to go right back to the very beginning. And in terms of my personal history, that's actually 1986, when I was a junior researcher at the Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. And I proposed to the director of the lab there that we should have a small program on the human and policy aspects of climate change. This was just at that time an emerging issue. And I still have a very vivid memory of being stopped in the corridor by a former deputy administrator of the US Environmental Protection Agency. And he said, "Hello, Steve." He said, "I hear you're thinking about trying to develop work on climate change." I said, "That's right." He says, "You're wasting your time, son." He said, "Climate will never be a major public policy issue." I said, "That's very interesting. Why is that?" He said, "There are 3 reasons. One, it's too far in the future. Second, the science is too uncertain. And third, there's no easy villain to blame it on." I think my response was, I agree with you entirely. Those are the 3 reasons why climate change is going to become a major public policy issue. Because it's like a Christmas tree. And people will bring to it their own issue and hang it on the climate change issue. And so we had this situation whereby basically we had this issue multiplier effect. Was it climate change an environmental issue, a technology issue, an economic issue, a development issue, an international political issue, an equity issue, a legal issue, so on and so forth. Frank's just said he wants to hang his ornament of UN reform on the climate change Christmas tree. And so basically we had this situation, I think, whereby climate change became a vehicle to which a whole range of other agendas became subjugated. And at the same time, there was this enormous act of reductionism that went on, which is that basically climate got reduced to one of 2 numbers. You can take your choice. It's 2 degrees or 350 parts per million. And this became basically the way in which climate change was framed. It's about controlling emissions, controlling concentrations, and temperature. And so it was hardly surprising, really, that when you have this tension between loading all of these issues onto climate change and using the carbon issue to try to leverage a whole range of political agendas, at the same time as reducing the huge complexity of climate change itself to simply 2 numbers, that by the time we got to Copenhagen, the wheels fell off the bandwagon. And at that time, and subsequently indeed, it has been fashionable to blame laggard participants, particularly the United States, more recently China, for the failure at Copenhagen. But I think actually the problem was much more fundamental than that. And I want to go back to 3 analogies that were used or in thinking about constructing the climate regime in the first place. Because I think until we deconstruct those analogies, it's going to be very difficult for us to do the kind of scholarship that's necessary to move on from where we are today. The first of those analogies was the ozone regime. And at the time that the framework at the time of the Framework Convention on Kyoto was being put into place, There was a lot of buoyancy about the success of the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol for controlling substances that deplete the ozone layer. And at first sight, people thought this climate change was very much like this kind of problem. It's a problem of the industrial emissions of gases into the atmosphere, and therefore this is a model for the way in which we will go about solving the problem. And from this we borrowed the Convention and Protocols approach. Unfortunately, however, the analogy turns out not to have been a very good one. We were talking about a small suite of artificial industrially produced gases produced by a small number of firms in a small number of countries, and for which there was a readily available technological substitute. The analogy falls on all of those fronts. Sadly, there were two things we could have learned from the ozone regime that we didn't. And one of those was one that Robin referred to yesterday, and that's the importance of, sometimes, the importance of failure. In the construction of the ozone regime, there was an attempt at Vienna, where the Framework Convention was put in place, to enact a protocol for the banning of spray cans. That failed. And because of the failure of that, there was a great deal of activity at the sub-state level among scientists, among diplomats, among NGOs, and among firms across the national boundaries, to develop a consensus that by the time they got to Montreal, basically it was possible to put in place a much more rigorous regime that was to limit the production of CFCs and subsequently, after the London amendments, to phase them out altogether. And that's the other important thing we could have learned, which is actually the Montreal Protocol doesn't address emissions. It addresses production. It controls production of the CFCs. In other words, it goes straight to the technology that is at the root of the emissions problem there. We didn't learn those two lessons. Perhaps now we need to rethink them. The second analogy was the US Environmental Protection Agency's sulfur trading program. This has proven to be a very successful whereby electric utilities in the United States were able to trade emissions in order to avoid having to ship very much more expensive, clean Western coal to Eastern power stations that were emitting large quantities of sulfur dioxide. The trading program worked extremely well. And this was the model, indeed, which economists then took actually to the White House and got the US then to sell as part of the Kyoto architecture. And the problem there was, of course, that the trading program that worked very well for sulfur was trading among a small number of traders, electric utility companies, a single gas, which was directly under their control, and thirdly, within a single legal regime that was able to enforce contracts and ensure compliance. Again, the analogy fails when it comes to carbon. And then the third analogy, and this is one that some people are not particularly conscious of, was actually the Strategic Arms Reduction treaty, which was concluded between the United States and the then Soviet Union to achieve the gradual, mutually verifiable stage reductions in nuclear warheads. And that's where we get the model of mutually verifiable stage reductions in national emissions. And of course, the failure of the analogy there is also obvious because basically those warheads were directly under government control. You only have two parties to the agreement. You try to extend that to the notion of carbon emissions and you see the flaws. And by the way, if you're skeptical of the idea that that regime informed the architecture for the carbon regime, it was actually Leon Firth, who was Al Gore's chief of staff, who took those ideas from one realm into the other. And Gore, of course, was, before he became known as an environmental policy wonk, was best known as a national security policy wonk in the United States. So I think we can see that basically there were some fundamental underlying flaws in the architecture from the very beginning. And subsequent to Copenhagen, some of those flaws have been increasingly recognized. although I find it remarkable that particularly amongst my economist colleagues who come up with a very similar critique of the conventional policy architecture to that which I have been expressing for many years, nevertheless still hang on to the idea of carbon pricing as the instrument that's going to cut through all the trouble. Recently, Richard Toll, very controversial figure because of his withdrawal from authorship of the IPCC Working Group 3 report because of its catastrophism, was nevertheless writing on his blog, but of course we could fix all of this with one fell swoop if only we had a proper carbon price. My colleague at Oxford, Dieter Helm, wrote in his book recently, The Carbon Crunch, showing the weakness of the fluctuations of carbon pricing through the EU ETS, but advocating a carbon price with border adjustments as the instrument. And I think that's very interesting, the way that, in a sense, that it's very difficult for people with strong disciplinary commitments to particular theoretical frameworks to question those, even when you see demonstrable evidence that the framework isn't working. And my colleague, Bjorn Ohler's colleague, Roger Pilkey, has in fact expressed this in perhaps a rather dramatic form as Pilkey's iron law, which is whenever the price of carbon or of energy comes into conflict with economic development goals, the climate will lose every time. And I think we can see this time and time again with the fuel tax escalator in the United Kingdom, with the attempt by Clinton in his first term of office to impose a modest gasoline tax for carbon reasons in the United States. Every time diesel goes up in France, the truckers blockade the gas stations and so on and so forth. The other thing about carbon pricing is that it's produced some very strange bedfellows. Robin will recognise both of these characters. They're Bill Shorten and Tony Abbott. And I'm not suggesting they're the bedfellows, but it's the policies they espouse that are the bedfellows. Because we have this bizarre situation in Australia where the Labour Party did enact a carbon tax and then subsequently lost office. Mr. Abbott came to power vowing to remove that carbon tax and replace it with, quote, direct measures. Now, whether or not you take him seriously and you think his direct measures are going to be effective or very direct, nevertheless, that was the rhetoric. What's bizarre about this is you have a left-of-centre party, the Labour Party, now fiercely defending a neoliberal policy instrument of carbon pricing, and a Conservative Party coming in and saying, we want to sweep all that neoliberal policy instrument away and replace it with direct measures, which means basically regulation and subsidies and things of that sort. So it's interesting also to see how, in fact, these issues produce some very strange convolutions in the policies that people are pursuing. Anyway, to get to the turning point of what I'm going to say, I think what we've seen subsequent to Copenhagen is a group of quite diverse responses. There have been those that have recognized the importance of decomposing the problem into bite-sized pieces. I have been myself identified very much as the bottom-up kind of person, but in fact I've never rejected the notion that treaties were not of symbolic importance, and as an anthropologist I take symbols very seriously. I think they can be very much focusing. But nevertheless, the notion of decomposing the problem into bite-sized pieces, I know John Vogler here has been involved in talking about building blocks approaches and things, which I don't think are entirely dissimilar to the kind of approach that I've been proposing, although I've been emphasising the bottom-up, really in contrast with the very heavy top-down approach that we had prior to Copenhagen. I think we've seen various proposals, including those of the Hartwell Group, to restructure the mitigation problem as a technology challenge rather than as an environmental problem. The way we treat it as an environmental problem basically is a very old-fashioned way. We treat carbon emissions as an end-of-the-pipe problem. We now have national pipes, theoretically constructed, but basically what are we trying to do? We're trying to control what's coming out of the end of those pipes, rather than doing what we did with ozone-depleting substances, which was actually go right to the technologies that were generating the problem in the first place. We've heard proposals to tackle short-term climate forcing agencies. Very agents. Very important, I think, is the recognition that we can't go on treating adaptation as merely as a cost of failed mitigation, which condemns it always then to the poor cousin status that sadly it has enjoyed. And in fact, even though it's no longer the taboo subject it once was, I remember in the late 1980s and early 1990s, if I attempted to talk about adaptation, it was a bit like talking to Southern Baptists in the United States about sex education in schools. This was seen as a very bad idea because it was going to encourage bad behavior, the notion that we would continue to emit because we would adapt ourselves out of trouble. And of course, we've had a whole range of issues and foci on subnational actions and collaborations between provinces, cities, firms, voluntary actions on both mitigation and adaptation. And I welcome the broadening out of that agenda. I think there are still differences in the research community over the mix of bottom-up and top-down policies that we would prefer, and I think that's very much linked to partly to the disciplinary disciplinary affiliations of people, and also to other kinds of value preferences. And I think that really highlights another issue, which is the problem of trying to change people's values by recourse to facts. And I'm going to say a little bit more of that in a moment. But I think that with all of these diverse responses, there is still a lingering sense of the second best, that somehow these are a response to the failure of Copenhagen. And I think that in itself handicaps the alternative approaches, or the new emerging approaches, which is that we confront them with a sense of fatalism, of failure, that this is, we tried to do the first best thing and it hasn't worked, now what can we resort to? And while we continue to have that mentality, I think we will continue to fail. I now want to go on to talk a bit about some of the problems of scholarship and politics, and what happens when scholarship and politics come into interaction with each other. Astrida, yesterday, in the talk she gave about post-human feminism, was very frank about saying she felt very uncomfortable about some of her conclusions because she felt that she would be accused of siding with the climate denialists. I, by the way, am a Senator Inhofe certified climate denialist. I'm on his list of climate deniers. This is despite the fact that I have actually protested to his office about this. I have never denied the science of climate change. I accept the IPCC Working Group 1's findings. And despite the fact that the New York Times even ran an article upon Inhofe's inclusion of myself and various other people who are not deniers on that list. How does this happen? Well, it's because I'm critical of the architecture, and that was enough for me to find myself being embarrassingly embraced by the deniers themselves, and at the same time reviled by climate activists as being a denier. And I'm just using that personal experience and the confidence that Astrida shared with us yesterday as a way of highlighting the discomfort that comes from trying to explore alternative framings that step too far outside of the conventional framing of the climate problem, as I described it at the very beginning here. And this has been very much highlighted by the absence of this colleague from this meeting today. Some of you will recognize that's Roger Pilkey Jr., who was recently extensively vilified in the US blogosphere in an attack led by the President's Chief Science Advisor, John Holdren, subsequently enjoined by such luminaries as Michael Mann. What was his sin? His sin was actually taking issue with the claim that we are going to be seeing very high rates of increase in costs and loss of life through increased storm intensity with the advent of climate change. And what Roger pointed out was that, in fact, if you go back 50 years, there's been a very slight increase in hurricane frequency and intensity in the US. If you go back 100 years, the trend disappears. But what Roger was really trying to point out was, whether you look historically or to the future, any climate effect is absolutely dwarfed by asset location and by economic development. Now, why would this have proven so controversial? I think that's not entirely disconnected with the publication of the most recent US National Climate Assessment, which very much plays up a catastrophist theme in trying to persuade Americans that climate change is real. And it certainly seems to be no coincidence that, in a sense, this was a preemptive strike against a scholar who, when consulted by the media on this issue, is likely to have taken issue with the particular way in which that science was purportedly being presented in the national assessment. As a result of that controversy, Roger declined the invitation to be with us today because he didn't want to attract unwelcome attention to this meeting. But I think it's a very sobering story about how, if you step outside of the boundaries too far as a social scientist, you can attract a very stifling, strangling effect in terms of the kinds of response that you might get. I'll just leave you to judge for yourself on whether you think the national assessment version or the Holdren version or the Pielke Jr. version is correct. Some of you may recognize that as Miami Beach, Florida. That was Miami Beach, Florida in 1925. Tell me what you think actually is affecting the very rapid and significant increase in costs of storm damage in that part of the world. Is it increased hurricane intensity or is it asset location? I'll leave it to you to decide. Whilst on the theme of catastrophe, I want to actually also talk about the role of catastrophe politics more generally. I have a very different view from Frank's of the planetary boundaries hypothesis. This is a quote behind me. I won't read it out to you. You can all read it from the commentary piece by Rockstrom et al. In Nature in 2010. They went on to say there's reason to believe that most processes in nature are like this. Now, quite how you would measure the number of processes in nature so you could establish whether most of them were in fact non-linear or linear is a puzzle to me. But stepping aside from that a moment, I have consulted numerous climate scientists, all of whom have assured me that in fact the processes of change in the climate models are in fact to them even disturbingly linear in nature. So the argumentation here doesn't actually seem to comport with the science, and there was a very much a point-by-point repudiation of the planetary boundaries hypothesis published by Linus Blomqvist, where he went through each of these and demonstrated that in fact what it was not a violation of a planetary boundary, but a violation of a values commitment. And this is part of the problem, which is throughout the discussions on climate, whether they're in the international arenas or whether they're down the pub or wherever it is, we try to use science and recourse to ideas about nature in order to justify moral and political preferences of one sort or another. And we are all the time conducting values debates exactly about equity and things that Frank was quite rightly emphasizing in his talk just now, through this surrogate argument about science. And I think the catastrophism in particular has produced some rather strange, perverse results. One is it has produced calls for a nuclear revival. We now have environmental luminaries such as James Lovelock, people like Mark Linus, so on and so forth, calling for a revival of nuclear power. Not, I think, something that was anticipated by those who wanted to emphasize the catastrophist scenario in order to get leverage on emissions reductions and the broader climate issue. And I'm just going to, in my last few slides, talk about this topic, which is another way in which the presentation of climate in catastrophic terms, I think, has backfired on those who have presented it in that way. and that's in the area of calls for exploring climate geoengineering. Some of you will already be familiar with the field. It was defined by the Royal Society in a report of which I was a co-author as the deliberate large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment to counteract anthropogenic climate change. And very briefly, there's two kinds of things you can do, and there's two ways you can do both of these things. One is you can reflect some of the sun's energy back away from the Earth and into space, and the other is that you can take carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, you can do both of these things in two different ways. You can do them by intervening in, or if you don't like it, tinkering with Earth system processes, or you can do it by black box engineering. So an example of tinkering with an Earth system process to take carbon out of the atmosphere is the idea that you could add iron to iron-deficient parts of the ocean, cause a plankton bloom. The plankton then absorb the carbon dioxide in photosynthesis. Fish come along, eat the plankton, the fish poop sinks to the bottom of the floor, to the floor of the ocean. By the way, in some of the early experiments with this, the first part worked fine. They got a nice plankton bloom, and then jellyfish came along and ate the plankton. And jellyfish, unfortunately, have the wrong sort of poop. They have like floaty poop, and the carbon went back up into the atmosphere. So it didn't quite work. But anyway, you get the idea. To do sunlight reflection, it has been suggested we could imitate volcanoes and loft sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere that would reflect some of the Earth's energy away from the planet. We know that works because, in fact, when Mount Pinatubo erupted a few years ago, we had about a 1 degree global cooling effect that lasted for just a little under 2 years as a result of those sulfate aerosols. When it comes to black box engineering, you could take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by building machines that would actually extract the carbon dioxide. You can convert it then into carbonate rock, or you could compress it and put it into spent oil and gas wells, or you could put mirrors in space. The last one not being very widely explored because of the obvious cost implications. Now, there's a whole range of governance issues that this throws up, which I'm currently involved in researching, and I think which are of importance to us. There is a whole range of concerns being expressed. One is the moral hazard concern, the idea that, in fact, if we even raise the possibility of engineering our way out of the consequences of climate change, people will try less hard at mitigation. There I look back at what happened with adaptation. We refused to confront the necessity of adaptation for a very long time. Is this a similar situation? Will we in 20 years' time say, you know what, we're going to have to geoengineer? We should have been thinking about this a long time earlier. I don't know. There's concern about ecosystems disruption. The climate models that tell us about putting sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere are pretty good at predicting temperature changes, but they're not at all good at predicting the impacts on precipitation, and particularly on things like the Asian monsoon. So we could actually have what appears to be a very inexpensive, easy techno fix turn out to have very, very high costs indeed if you had disruption of Asian agriculture. There's problems of technical and socioeconomic lock-in. Technical lock-in is that if you've put these sulfate aerosols up there, you've put your sunshade up, you continue to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then you discover, say, you've screwed up the monsoon, so you say, okay, we'll stop doing it. Great. Within 2 years, those aerosols will rain out. The problem is you will now have a very sudden carbon spike, temperature spike, instead of the very gradual increase in temperature you would have had if you hadn't done that. So you have those kinds of problems. The whole question about governance is a very important one. It would seem, at least at first sight, that you could build machines to take carbon out of the atmosphere and stick it down spent oil and gas wells within the governance framework of existing environmental and planning legislation within nation states. But it would also seem that before you were going to be doing sulfate aerosols, you would probably have to have some kind of global treaty to agree to do that. And look how good we are at getting global treaties on climate change, right? So the thing that seems to be technically perhaps the easiest and the most quickest to bring to realization, the sulfate aerosols, would probably be institutionally the most difficult to achieve. Whereas, on the other hand, the thing that's institutionally easy to govern, the carbon dioxide removal technology using mechanical means, actually will be very distant in the future, because even if it turns out to be plausible, you'd have to build an industry on the scale of the fossil fuel and cement industries before you were affecting carbon concentrations, and then you would have a multi-decadal lag before you had an impact on climate. So basically, what we're faced with is what's known as the control dilemma. We would like to have the governance structures in place even before we do research on these questions. And there are those who suggest that we shouldn't even be contemplating doing research on any of these kinds of technologies, but particularly on the sulfate aerosols. And I commend to those of you who are interested to look at two books, one by David Keith and the other by Mike Hulme. They're both small little pocket books that you can read each one in about an hour, and they outline the case for and against, in fact, doing any research at all in this area. And they're both extremely good presentations of the respective arguments. There's been vociferous opposition. Some prominent figures have described geoengineering ideas in very unreserved terms. With respect to some of the involvement that I've been involved, that I've had in this issue, we have actually promulgated a set of principles, which I won't read out, but you can see them on the screen there, which we think represent the minimum conditions for governance of the research process, and the idea is that each of these would be accompanied by a set of technology-specific research protocols, recognizing that the technologies are extremely heterogeneous in terms of the technical practices involved. Putting sulfate aerosols in the atmosphere involves a completely different set of technologies and technical practices from taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sticking it down oil and gas wells. Again, I'm not going to read through them, but just to show you that this is some of the work that is going on in the field. But in closing, I just want to finish with perhaps a rather different view of the Anthropocene from that which Frank has presented you with earlier. And I do so start beginning with this quote from the person who has revived the idea of the Anthropocene. It's not a new idea, by the way. It was around in the 19th century. It was originally proposed by a gentleman by the name of Stepani, and very similar hypotheses have been promulgated at the early part of this century. People like George Perkins Marsh in his book, The World Transformed by Human Action, and so on and so forth. So it's not an entirely new idea, firstly. But secondly, I think we've got to be very wary about the idea, because notwithstanding the opportunities that Frank sees here, I see some really significant dangers from a governance point of view. And I'm not attributing to Paul Crutzen sinister motives, but I think the implications of this quotation are typical. The daunting task that lies ahead is for scientists and engineers to guide society towards environmentally sustainable management. And this really worries me, because it seems to me this is a license for technocracy. This is not a license for democracy. This is my second to last slide. I'd like to be able to tell you that this was produced satirically by an opponent of such ideas. Actually, no, it's produced by a German ministry. You don't actually have to be able to read German to be able to see the symbolism here of the of John Schellenhuber nobly declaiming about the importance of science, and you can see a very contrite, small Barack Obama head bent down into the phone. You know, I'm doing my best, sir. You know, it seems to me that this couldn't be a self-parody if you tried to produce it of exactly what I find alarming about the concept of the Anthropocene, and maybe we can have some discussion of that at the end. But I'll leave you in the spirit, actually, of Astrida's presentation yesterday, where she was showing us some art installations. This is an art installation by Thomas Saraceno, an Argentine who lives and works in Frankfurt. This is part of his Cloud Cities work, and I leave it with you because I think the message is that when we're thinking about climate change, we've got to get beyond thinking of it as a policy design problem as a governance problem, in a technical governance problem, and recognise that it's a fundamental challenge to the human imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for very thoughtful intervention, and I think the two keynote speakers, they speak to each other. I'm sure we are running into coffee time, but I'm sure that this have provoked questions, so shoot. Yes. Robin. Yes.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was wonderful. Two quick points. The first one about the Anthropocene. I'm really relieved to hear you say what you said about the Anthropocene. I have a PhD student who's looking at exactly this, and in many ways says the idea of the Anthropocene is an idea we needed to have to legitimate geoengineering, which is, I think, very much in keeping with what you said. Overall, what I'm hearing from you is an appreciation of complexity, an awareness of uncertainty, an honesty, a healthy skepticism, and a desire to learn from our mistakes. I agree with your arguments about some of the false analogies that helped to drive us in shaping the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. But what I didn't actually hear is a positive defence of the alternative approaches of bottom-up. It seemed to be implicit in the critique of the analogies that they're necessarily better, but I don't think that follows. So I'm a little puzzled about what would be your general arguments to say that, you know, it was a wrong way go back that we should have done back in the 1992 and the negotiations leading up to that. I mean, if we could reverse back to then, what would you have had in its place?
Well, actually, I sometimes tongue-in-cheek claim to have been a critic of the Kyoto Protocol since 1988. Think about that for a moment, which was when, in fact, I published a paper with an anthropologist called Luther Gerlach, where we actually said at that point the big treaty approach to climate change isn't going to work, and that what we've got to do is to actually have a much greater appreciation of the differential capabilities of countries around the world to actually get to grips with the problem and to accept a much more dispersed model of social action in order to come to grips with climate change. And in fact, Ronnie was at the conference where I first presented that. So there has been a critique that has been, and an alternative model that has actually been around since the very beginning. Unfortunately, though, and this is something interesting for us as social scientists, it came out of anthropology, which is a very weak discipline in terms of the power relationships of social science. And to try to get a hearing for that kind of alternative architecture that we tried right the way from 88 through to 1998 with the publication of the 4 volumes of Human Choice and Climate Change was, you know, basically really banging up against much greater power from international relations, political science and economics. And so, you know, that's part of also of the lesson, I think, for us to learn from scholarship here is, you know, to recognize the power disparities within our own and among our own disciplines. I could offer a positive argument for the bottom-up approach, and I don't have time now, but you'll be delighted to learn that there is a new book which will be out anytime now called The Hartwell Approach to Climate Policy, which actually contains a whole selection of the papers over the 20-year period that offered that alternative perspective, and I'm happy to share that. But
okay, let's pick up 2 more questions. First Jacques and then Jürgen.
Thanks, Steve, for that lucid presentation. I also like the fact that you did your best to kind of focus on solutions in one of your slides. My question is very much along the same lines with Robin. Is it fair to say that those of you that tend to defend the bottom-up approach, so-called, are also actually only exaggerating your position, perhaps in order to get attention? Because the bottom-up approach, or the technology approach, or whatever you call it, actually are a lot of those technological regimes are within the so-called big treaty. So what in practice is really the main difference between the so-called technology approach as you see it and the treaty approach? And just to add to that, are you envisioning a world where an approach to technology in solving the problem of climate change can get around the issues of politics?
I think those are two slightly different questions, somewhat different questions. With regard to the first, have we been placing a heavier emphasis on the bottom up in order to get attention to the non-top-down dimensions? I think that's probably fair to say that that is the case. I mean, that's of necessity. The arguments in favour of the top-down approach, the unified treaty, have been long in place and well understood, and I think that there has been a process of trying to get more of the bottom-up kind of elements into there. But as I said, I've never actually repudiated the idea that treaties can be of symbolic importance or can be facilitative. I do remain sceptical that anything that's going to emerge out of the treaty process in the foreseeable future is going to be the instrumental means by which we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deal with the very important issues of adaptation. And that's why I want to focus on the things that I think can actually have the instrumental impact. And I think basically it is things like technological innovation that's going to do the heavy lifting here, whilst the diplomatic processes carry on. As to whether I think that there's any technical way to simply get around the politics, no, of course not. I mean, that's one of the problems that I have with geoengineering, which is the area I'm currently focusing most of my research on, is that I think it is conceived of as a way of cutting through the Gordian knot of climate politics with a single sweep of the sword. And of course it will turn out to be nothing of the sort, because I think as soon as you start to get into the whole question of actually what kind of financing would be necessary to do carbon sequestration, what kind of regulatory governance framework would you want to do, sulfate aerosols and so forth, you get straight back into the politics. And so I think there is this illusion of a space empty of incumbents, which is this geoengineering space, which is seen as a way of short-circuiting all the problems and cutting through the politics. But of course, as a social scientist, I don't believe that for a moment.
Okay, let's bring in one last question from Jörgen Wetterstad.
Yes, Jörgen Wetterstad from the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. Perhaps not so surprising, I have a question related to carbon pricing, because I think one of the really interesting developments that have taken place in the recent years is the turn to emissions trading in China. And I just wondered if you see that turn as a turn in the wrong direction.
I think emissions trading within national boundaries is a much more plausible policy instrument than international emissions trading.
Okay.
Yeah.
With that note, we end this segment, and now coffee will be served outside here. But first, a big thank you to Steve and Frank. Thank you.